Micah Sifry. Thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
My pleasure.
All right, how about we start with let's start with an introduction with you. How about you spend some time talking about yourself? Like, do you have experience working in the government? And if so, what was that like?
Oh, no, I'm not actually, I've never worked for the government. My background is in journalism. Um, I started out many years ago, literally as an intern at The Nation magazine, one of the country's oldest liberal journals of opinion. And I worked my way up the ladder there to associate editor. That's where I learned the craft. And I've been writing and reporting about a variety of subjects, uh, ranging from American foreign policy to tech and politics, um, ever since. I've written or edited 9 books, um, including a couple of anthologies on topics like the Gulf War and the Iraq War, and the last 10, 15 years, I've really specialized more in the intersection of technology, politics, movements, and organizing. But um, what I've always been most interested in is how people organize themselves um, to get the political system to respond to them effectively. How do we make democracy work for everybody, basically? Um, so while I know lots of people who do work in government, certainly the piece we're going to talk about uh, came about in part because of that. No, I've personally never actually worked in government.
Yeah. So I guess yeah, let's talk about your experience when it comes to organizing and like you witnessing how like loads of different people would organize around the country. In your
Mm-hmm.
experience, and you've been doing this for like several decades, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. In the several decades that you've worked in that field, what's your experience for like what time period had the largest like mass protests and mass organizing? And on what scale would you say that was?
Well, that's a great question because there are many different ways to measure, uh, you know, participation. Um, and before the internet came along, um, I think it would be fair to say that it was in general harder to participate in the public arena. Um, if you wanted your message to be heard by other people, um, either you had to be, famous or lucky enough to be invited onto television. There were only a handful of TV news channels. Everybody watched the basically got the same somewhat narrow uh, and highly curated version of what's going on in public events. And yet there were lots of smaller outlets. People maybe, uh, handfuls of people would read little magazines like the one I worked at, The Nation. Um, but for the most part, uh, participating was something that people did sporadically. Uh, sure, millions of people voted, um, but the daily ability to participate in the public conversation was dramatically smaller. Um, so if you did manage to organize a bunch of people to go to a demonstration, Martin Luther King, the civil rights movement famously got 250,000 people to march on Washington in 1963, and that was a huge undertaking. It took months of preparation of they sold tickets. They organized buses. They had to figure out where all those people were going to stay while they were in Washington for in the middle of the week. The Whereas today, you know, uh, we all take for granted that it's incredibly easy to participate in the public conversation. All it takes is, rudimentary knowledge of social media. You don't even have to write something; you can just like it, and you've in effect added your voice. If you want to get 250,000 people to come to a rally today, what you still need is a compelling message, but anybody with just some very basic skills can create a website. It's not that hard to, invite people to an event, and people will spread the information for you. And so we're in this sort of paradoxical situation where it's become a lot easier. And so we have mass participation in politics in a way that we never had before. For 20 years, I helped start and ran a conference called Personal Democracy Forum. And the reason we called it personal democracy, other than the fact that we liked that the acronym was PDF, which was a joke, was the idea that now, in the same way that you had a personal computer on your desk and soon in your pocket, you could be personally involved. And the obstacle to not only just being involved, but being a leader, being someone who was initiating things, whether you were raising money yourself or organizing your own thing, the barrier to entry had dropped dramatically. The costs had dropped dramatically. And so, when you make something cheaper and easier to do, you get more of it. So we now live in an age of mass participation. Big rallies are still rare. The April 5th, we had something like 1,400 protests across the United States, all under the same banner of hands off, which were protests of what Trump is doing. And roughly around 3 million people participated. And that's a pretty big number. There are only a few examples going back decades where you can point to days of protest where millions of Americans in the multiples participated. So we're in a moment where there's a lot of it. It's not the first time we've ever had a moment like this. What may be different, because we just 2 weeks later, we had another day of mass protests. And this time it's possible across 700 locations that maybe around the same number of people participated. So we're moving into a period in America where I think we're going to see ongoing ferment. And this is because what Trump is doing is they are flooding the zone with some very drastic, I'm trying to use neutral words here, very big changes. They are breaking many of the norms of how
Can
America
you,
has worked.
can you explain why you're using neutral words and like why you see that as important?
Well, I think if you use the American left is full of people who use fancy jargon to describe things that they've studied for a long time. The effect of doing that can make the conversation less accessible to people who do not obsess every day about politics. So,
And maybe there's a perception that it's incredibly biased, and like it might be biased, it might not be biased, but there's a perception that it is biased.
well, yeah, though the other side is also constantly gaming this. Um, but I think that people can reason for themselves about what's going on and make, draw their own conclusions. And so I am a big believer in show before tell. And yes, I do think what's happening is not normal, not like other Republican administrations that have come to power in America before. And what's different is um, basically ignoring the law. You can come in with ideological goals. You want to change the direction of the country. Sure, we have ways of doing that. They're called pass a law, right? Get it through Congress, then let the duly appointed authorities decide what to do. What Trump and Musk, we have to bring Elon Musk into the conversation. What they've been doing is radically different. Um, they are breaking the government. They're not using normal processes for determining, for example, if someone they're firing uh, is actually an unproductive employee. Um, they're just going through. Well, he literally picked up a chainsaw, right? Um, they're cutting without looking. Oops, we happen to fire the people in charge of protecting us from Ebola. Oops, we happen to fire the people who, you know, keep the nuclear weapons safe. Oops, well, it's not oops. In many cases, they want to fire the people whose jobs have been to ensure that the weakest and most marginalized people in our country um, are taken care of. Uh, and they claim they're doing it in the name of efficiency, but that's a joke. Um, so it is different. Um, I do think there are people at the top of this administration who really, really want to use the all the potential power of a untrammeled executive to force Americans to live the way they think we should live. They want to take away people's freedom. They want to, in some cases, erase people's identities. Um, and they don't want anything to stand in their way. There is a word for all of that. The word is fascism. Um, and they're showing all the hallmarks of that. But if I started with that word, some people would just be like, ah, I don't want to listen anymore.
But how do you know
A,
that how do you know that part of their brain hasn't automatically switched on the moment that you said it now?
it may have, but they've been listening for the first few minutes already. Um, and I just don't, I also think words can convey more power than you mean. Um, the there's a movie version of fascism that I think a lot of people have grown up with, whether they watched movies about World War II or they watched Star Wars. Um, and you have this sense of like, uh, you know, total power, total obedience. Um, yeah, sure, there's a scrappy resistance, but they're constantly on the run. They have to get incredibly lucky, to blow up the Death Star.
Or yeah, they have to get incredibly lucky just to steal the plans to get like for the Death Star. Yeah.
Yes, right. Many Bothans died for the sake of this information. And those are wonderful stories, but I think they overstate what these places are actually like when they have existed in the world, which is to say, there's still people still go about their lives. There is still small acts of freedom and resistance, um, but in many cases, what people have done is they have internalized a sense of enough fear that they will censor themselves. So until there are tanks on the streets, um, And people checking my papers when I drive into town, to do my shopping, I am not going to give them the satisfaction of already behaving as if they've taken that much power. We're in the middle of we're in the middle of a gigantic question, which is, will freedom in America continue or not? But it's very unclear which way that's going to go. Um, and the evidence for that is also in the ways that Trump regularly backs down. Um, if he were a all-powerful dictator, then he could command the stock market and the bond market to do whatever he wants. Now, dictators in history have done that. They have shut down stock markets. They have imposed price controls. They have nationalized bank accounts. Those are ways to take even more power. But he hasn't done those things. And instead, when the stock market, started to really crash, suddenly he flip-flopped and decided to suspend most of his tariffs. Why? Because he was hearing from his own base that this was too chaotic, too dangerous, and there was already too much pain being inflicted. Now, if you're all powerful, you don't listen. But clearly, he's also a weather vane. And that's why the figuring out how to build a successful resistance is such an important question. That's why I wrote the piece I wrote in the Times, because I do think.
Wait, sorry, could you describe the piece that you wrote in the Times?
Yeah. I'm happy to do that. So the idea was, the way this piece came about is an editor at the New York Times actually reached out to me on the advice of one of her colleagues, because I had written something for one of her colleagues a few years earlier. And they were looking for ideas for an article about what could Democrats be doing better to build a successful opposition to Trump. If you recall, a few weeks back, he did his big speech before Congress, and you had a few members, sitting there with little paddles with words on them that were supposed to express
Are you talking
protest.
about Cory Booker?
Cory Booker was the last in this whole series. Cory Booker was maybe the first example of a Democrat doing something that broke through. But for the most part, Democrats were either capitulating, sitting on their hands, complaining that they didn't have any real power to do anything. And the base was really getting mad at them. So the Times was looking for a piece about what could Democrats do differently. And I basically wrote back and I said, you know what? I think you're asking the wrong question, because, the Democratic politicians, this is not their job. They are not, these people, especially the ones who are in the leadership, the reason they're in leadership is because they're good at two pretty important things in normal times. The first one is they know how to hold their entire coalition together, which you need to do if you're going to pass anything. And the second thing that they're good at is raising a lot of money, which is what they need to help their coalition get reelected. And if they're successful, go back to being a majority. So their main job, that's why Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries are the leaders in the in the Senate and in the House for the Democrats. And expecting Chuck Schumer to also be good at standing at a big demonstration and leading people in a protest chant, well, he didn't get the job because he was good at that. And obviously, when he tries to be good at that, it's really pathetic. What I said to the Times was, I think instead we should be looking at who are the potential leaders at the base, in the grassroots, that can build a movement that can then change the weather, right? Politicians are weather vanes. They are really good at figuring out which way the wind is blowing and making sure to move with it. And it's the rare ones who say, no, I'm actually going to take risks and try and lead people towards in a direction that they want to get people to. But what I said was, I think something interesting is brewing here, because there was no public expression of protest when Trump got reelected. Compared to the first time when, we got the Women's March, we had gigantic protests.
Okay, well, let's talk about this. What do you think are some of the main differences between anti-Trump protests after he got reelected compared to anti-Trump protests after he got elected for the first time?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when he got elected the first time, it was a giant shock, in particular, to the people who had really vested a lot of hopes and dreams on Hillary Clinton getting elected. And the first response after he won was shock. A lot of Democratic politicians and leaders of Democratic advocacy organizations, most of them were just like flat on their backs. There was a vacuum, and the vacuum was filled by women who were at the front edge of the people who were most shocked, right? They really thought Hillary was going to win, and when she didn't win, it was a gigantic stab in the heart of, and so it made sense that the people who then formed the base of this new protest wave were primarily women, and in particular, middle-aged white women, many of whom were radicalized, were like shocked into action for the first time in a long time. Many of them will tell you that they had not been politically active before this. And the people in the Democratic establishment kept thinking, well, we'll find a way to work with Trump. And it was the people on the margins, who actually stepped into leadership. So the whole first wave in 2017 had much more of a feminist coloration, much more progressive coloration.
Yeah, like
This
this also coincided with the Democratic Party shifting left on both gender issues and also racial issues. This is the whole phenomenon that Matthew Iglesias might refer to as like the Great Awakening, where
Well, the Great Awakening, I would say, took place as part of this in the sort of 2018, 2019, 2020. Me Too, it existed before 2016, but it really flowered afterwards. And same thing with Black Lives Matter, existed before 2016, but really took on a much bigger, more salience for many people. This time around, and then we had COVID. Let's remember what then happened, right? Like then we had there was a rising rebellion within the Democratic Party led by Bernie Sanders and kids in the environmental movement, who were building towards mass protests. This is like the Sunrise Movement and 350.org. And then COVID shuts that all down. Okay. I mean, Bernie was absolutely challenging Biden for the Democratic nomination
yeah.
until South Carolina, when the deal was cut to, basically smooth the way for Biden so that to stop Bernie. And then a few weeks later, COVID basically shut the rest of the primary process down. It also shut the environmental movement down. It shut every kind of organized operation. The George Floyd protests were more spontaneous than anything. I don't think there was anybody saying, let's do this. This is going to lead to great things. Um, and we have to recognize that then there was a lot of backlash. Biden beat Trump, but the backlash was also forming at the same time. So,
And part of the reason why Biden beat Trump is because Biden was seen as like the most moderate candidate out of all the other Democratic candidates at the time.
yeah, well, there was also a core desire on the part of Democrats. More than anything, they just wanted to beat Trump. And there is a good argument that where Bernie Sanders failed to close the deal was in explaining to people why he was the better candidate to beat Trump. Um, and that's the hinge of the Democratic primary. Who's the strongest candidate to beat Trump? In any event, COVID shut down most of the first wave of Trump resistance. All the groups shrank. The money shrank. Uh, so when January 6th happened, it was a shock, but we didn't see, there's one other thing that is always true about American politics is when your guy wins, you relax. Um, so there were a lot of people who really worked hard to ensure that Biden would win and worked hard to protect the results of that election and even worked hard to take the Senate in those special races in Georgia. But then once he got in, a lot of people checked out and said, oh, I could go back to normal life.
And it's such a shame because I do think that on the merits, like I honestly think January 6th warranted larger protests than the George Floyd protests. Um,
I think that, yes, though I think no one was prepared for it. Um, it was a fast moving event. It definitely traumatized a lot of people. One of the things I noticed, Andrew, and I definitely wrote about this in my Substack, is that January 6th was horrible, but for a lot of people, it was too much. And I saw this happen again and again. Whenever the media did like a really good reconstruction, the New York Times did one that's like a moment by moment reconstruction using all kinds of found video um, and I definitely heard from lots of people who basically said I can't look at it, that it was too upsetting, and so instead of it becoming something we organized around, it became something we tried to just put behind us. The January 6th Select Committee did a great job of tying all those pieces together into a story that mattered for people. And I think, again, more could have been done. But you know, the one of our problems in terms of trying to defend democracy in America today is that we don't have particularly strong civic institutions devoted to that problem. Um, we're very fragmented society. We do not have the way the right wing has a gigantic base in the evangelical church, plus um, dozens of motivated billionaires who have funded the creation of institutions that cultivate people from a young age to become leaders in their movement, and a media system that also constantly reinforces their messages. And there's nothing similar on the left. It's much more fragmented. It's much more short term in its orientation, and therefore weaker. So anyway, to fast forward to 2024 and the moment we're in now, Um, when Trump got reelected, I would argue that for a lot of people, it was upsetting, but it was accepted because it's very hard to argue, not just with an electoral college victory, but a popular vote victory. He didn't win a landslide, but he won more votes than Kamala Harris.
Yeah, he won every single swing state.
He won the marginal states. Um, and so I think a great many people on the rule of law side who have always said we have to respect the results of elections when they are conducted in a free and fair way, we're like, okay, we have to accept this. Um, and so there were not gigantic protests around Trump's inauguration. You know, the Women's March in 2016 took place the day after his inauguration, and something like 5 million people marched across the country. This time around, this Women's March and some other groups did call for protests the Saturday before his inauguration. And I think about 50,000 people showed up in DC. Diehards and young people for whom this was like the first time they were, kind of dealing with something. What changed? Why are we seeing such big protests now? I would say it's because what they're doing is so extreme, is so it's such a flood the zone. They are hitting so many people that they're lighting up a lot of people. And the federal workers are like the people who are being most affected most quickly. So the piece I wrote argued that instead of waiting for some politician to catch fire by, just saying the right words, we should look towards the people who are already on fire because they're being thrown out of their jobs willy-nilly. They're being harassed with ridiculous emails telling them to list the 5 things they did this week that to justify continuing to have their jobs. They're seeing their life's work literally and gleefully thrown into the wood chipper, as Musk put it. And all of this being done without any sort of respect for the normal processes of government, which is, yeah, you can fire people, but you have to show cause. You have to actually show that they were unproductive. I mean, there are many things you have to do. You can't just say, oh, well, Congress, we're going to ignore the fact that you created this agency and gave it money to do the following things. We're not going to pass a law getting rid of the agency. We're just going to fire all the people inside the agency. And maybe we'll have 3 of them left just to answer the phones. So we can claim that we didn't actually get rid of it. That's way beyond the pale. And that's caused a lot of people a lot of pain. But I would say the silver lining is it's also surfacing for Americans who, for the most part, don't realize how much government does for them, how big a factor our government is in our lives. Now, all of a sudden, if you're a veteran or you have friends or family who are veterans, it's like they want to cut 20% of the VA workforce. It's already challenging enough to get quality care. And by the way, I think it's improved a lot over the last few years. You're not going to improve the lives of veterans by doing this. You're going to hurt them. And these people have authenticity. They have a story to tell that is really hard to argue with. So I feel like the silver lining is, as Joni Mitchell put it in her song, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. And that's causing a lot of people to suddenly talk about all the things we count on government to do. if they get rid of NOAA, the weather agency, that means we won't get as accurate forecasting of hurricanes and tornadoes and droughts and floods, and farmers who rely on, the forecasts to plan their crops. All of these kinds of things that we just take for granted, that it just works. It doesn't just work. There are people inside the government who make these things work. Um, and so they're in the process of wrecking all of that. But I think we, especially if we listen to these sort of newly radicalized federal workers, um, may also learn what it is we're fighting for. Why are we trying to stop this? What are we attempting to defend?
Okay, so one thing that you said that I thought was really interesting is how a lot of Americans they didn't really realize the impact that government work was having for them
Right.
until now. I guess I have two questions to ask you about that. So I guess the first would be, do you think that the median American views government service as inherently corrupt?
I think it is a story that has been spread, particularly by right wing media, which has an ideological goal, which is to weaken support for government enough um, that people will stop defending it, and you can therefore, strip it down to almost nothing, and in turn just give people a big tax refund. Um, and so corrupt isn't necessarily the only word. It's also wasteful, uh, and slow.
Yeah,
You know,
maybe there is still a lot of bit of wasteful and slow, but I would postulate that ever since Donald Trump took over the Republican Party, I think corrupt has become more and more frequent of a belief in government. Like the government is secretly run by a deep state that is
yeah,
like all doing all of this to benefit themselves. Like they're like this is all inherently broken, and like all of these people are lining up their pockets and like scamming us and so on and so
yes.
forth.
But you asked if the median American believes that, and I think the answer is no. I think there's a hardcore 30%, 35%, um, the majority of the Republican Party who does believe that. And so they think what Trump is doing is justified because he's basically, trying to pull this whole corrupt, evil thing out by its roots. But are again, well, how do you define median voter, right? Um,
Yeah, like the
but
swing voter who votes based on the price of eggs, maybe.
Well, the swing voter who votes on the basis of the price of X absolutely wanted change over continuity in this last election, and in the end, um, the Democrats were, I think, really in a very tough position uh, to defend the status quo when the status quo was not working for most people. Um, and Trump's ability to parry all efforts to warn people about how dangerous he would be. Most people, the polls show this, did not believe that Trump would actually do all the things that we were warning he would do. You would say to people, look at Project 2025, right? It's all laid out there in detail. And Trump himself denied that he had read it or had anything to do with it. That was a total lie. Um, but the desire for change it's kind of a constant now that people want uh, big changes in the status quo. What I would say is there's a lot of latent buyer's remorse taking place where you hear people say, I voted for Trump, but I didn't think that meant I would lose my job. Or
I
I
didn't
didn't
think I would lose a big chunk of my Social Security, like that
or I
sort of
didn't
sentiment.
think my 401k would go down so drastically. I didn't think there would be this much chaos. Um, and he's there's this very cliched idea in American politics that every president gets a honeymoon, the first 100 days roughly. And in those first 100 days, they try and do a lot. Famously, this comes from Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who did a ton of stuff in his first 100 days in 1933. And Doug Sosnick actually had a very good opinion piece in the Times, I think yesterday or the day before, where he pointed out that every president comes in at a fairly robust level of support, something over 50%. And then in those first 100 days, when they do lots of things, the number begins to drop, but it doesn't drop that much because they're in their honeymoon. And we're kind of going, let's give the guy a chance. After all, he got elected. We have to hope he succeeds. And then after those first 100 days, their popularity really starts to decline. And for American presidents, popularity is historically the main source of their power. Trump may be different, we'll see, but Trump is already below 50%. And he's not even done with his first 100 days. He is starting off at a historically low level. And if the turmoil, the questions about tariffs and the market and so on, if all that continues, it's not going to get better for him. It's going to get worse. And I think the worsening is that median voter, those people who don't pay close attention to politics, kind of going, wait, this isn't what I was expecting. And that, again, by the way, goes back to, earlier in our conversation, why I'm trying not to use these heavy labels like fascist. I think people have to come to that conclusion themselves, that what he's doing is not within the normal, this isn't like a football game where one side just happens to be really good at driving the ball to the other end. This is like a game where one side is saying, the ref called us offsides, but we're ignoring the ref because we still have the ball.
And we're threatening to kill the families of the ref if
We're
it doesn't
telling
go.
our fans to go kill go bomb the house that the ref lives in because
Yeah.
we don't like that ref.
And like they're
That's
they're they're saying it to the entire stadium, and the stadium thinks that they're just joking. Yeah.
Well, no, I mean, this is why it's outside the boundaries of what normally happens. They are currently and flagrantly disobeying a Supreme Court order. We're in the middle of a short process by which the lower court judge is in the middle of trying to get that order enforced. And we may see fairly soon if they continue to disobey the Supreme Court or not. That will be a real inflection point. To go back to your football game analogy, the normal way these things work is, we call this the thermostatic behavior of the American electorate, right? A thermostat works like if the government gets too hot, then the public rewards the party that's going to cool things down, right? And if the government is too cool, then they vote in the people who will warm things up some more. So which is why almost every midterm after a president gets elected, his party loses seats in the House and Senate. Will we have a normal midterm a year and a half from now? That's really the big question.
I guess, yeah, let's play out some of the implications of what I think you're saying. So you talk about how normally the approval rating sort of determines how powerful a president is. But like you also try to allude to Trumpism as fascism.
Yep.
Like traditionally has approval ratings impacted like how powerful like fascists have been throughout history. Assuming like let's assume that I were to accept that analogy at face value. Does approval rating matter for that specific type of authoritarianism?
Well, I would say this partly depends on whether you continue to have free elections or not. Um, so, you know, if Trump was able to basically shut down the free press and, you know, intimidate other independent institutions like universities, like labor unions, like um, the military for sure, and either get them to be silent or to get them to be demonstrably just beholden to him, then we're not living in anything where the pendulum can just swing back anymore. Okay. I mean, Hitler, to go straight to that example, I mean, in 60 days, he basically got emergency powers that effectively made the German Reichstag, the Congress, completely just a rubber stamp. They had no power whatsoever. But he killed opponents within his own party. I mean, the repression was swift, uh, and we're nowhere close to that. We've had countries. Poland is a good example. Okay, for the Law and Order Party in Poland, in many ways, it was a Trumpist party. They were absolutely trying to destroy the independence of the judiciary and of the media. And despite that, we just saw elections take place in Poland where the leading opposition party, along with two smaller parties, formed an alliance and they won enough seats in their country's parliament to throw the ruling party out. Okay. And what that says is that sometimes, you're in this situation, the political scientists call it competitive authoritarianism, which means that there's still elections and in theory, there's still competition for who can win, but the election is so rigged, the whole system is so tilted that the opposition can never really win. And we're somewhere in that, we're drifting or we're being pushed in the direction of that kind of situation. But we're nowhere, I don't think we're all the way there. I also think you've got to remember that we're very much a federal system. And even though Trump is, and the MAGA Congress is trying to pass laws that would change how states conduct their own elections, right? Um, I don't think any of the blue states are going to let that law, if it even gets through the Senate, which it probably won't, they're not going to let them change how they operate their own elections. The Trump Department of Education is ordering state departments of education to get rid of DEI programs. And in a number of blue states, New York, Washington State are the ones that come to mind. The State Department of Education has said, screw you. We think these are important. And you don't have any power over telling us, even if you try and turn the screw with the federal grant money that, you might try and withhold, we'll sue you. You can't just do that. So we're seeing this fight still underway. And the story isn't over yet. It could. I mean, I'm not saying this has to end with a happy ending, but the fact that his popularity is declining is important because if you're a marginal member of the Republican Party in Congress and you're hearing from your constituents that particular policies are hurting them, you're also beginning to worry, am I going to lose my next election? Now, some of these people are true believers and they won't care, but a lot of them are pragmatic politicians, right? Um,
And even
and
the ones like if there's enough so like if there is enough resistance against Trump, then maybe the true believers will lose in future elections.
that's completely possible. Um, we have had elections that are big swings, so that could happen. Um, it's it's still anybody's guess. And again, so goes back to why, one of the arguments I was trying to make in the New York Times piece is that the nature of the opposition to Trump matters. And that this time, to the extent that federal workers are part of that rising resistance in terms of who is out there speaking at rallies and what do they represent. Um, it's coming from what you might call the sort of uh, it's almost a politically neutral center. Many people who go to work in government are there because they just want to serve the American people. You will hear them use that phrase. A lot of them will tell you, by the way, you know, I swore an oath to the Constitution when I started this job. 30% of them are veterans, and those are people who voluntarily served in the military because they felt called to serve their country. And then after leaving the military, they go work for the government, not just because it's a good job with good benefits, but because they still want to serve their country. When you frame your opposition to what Trump is doing in that kind of language, I would argue, you may be able to reach a lot of people for whom the kind of style and rhetoric that the Women's March and the left used in 2017 to oppose Trump the first time came off as more coming from the political margins, more, for some people, absolutely necessary. We have to protect the people at the margins. Um, but I would say, if anything, I want to make sure that if I'm trying to protect unpopular people who some people feel like, oh, that's weird or that's different and I don't understand it. I want to be able to do it from the strongest possible place. And so that sense of service, of defending the rule of law, the Constitution, and that government exists to serve all people I think those are really powerful, powerful messages. And it would be foolish if what you're trying to do is weaken Trump to the point where he can't do the stuff he's trying to do because it's really unpopular and he starts losing even Republican support. The way to do it is go for the high ground. Do not leave the high ground to them.
So like all like the stuff that you said about how government workers, a lot of them took a pledge to the Constitution and joined because they wanted to serve their country. So like assuming I were to take all of that at face value, I guess my instinctual reaction would just be to say that a lot of us Americans are really spoiled and don't deserve the service that they've been giving us. If like so many of us just think that they're inherently like rigging the system, or a lot of them are inherently corrupt, when in reality, a lot of them are like actively going out of their way to serve the American people. Um,
I think a lot of this goes back to what stories we learn and share and amplify. Um, you know, uh, and there's definitely a challenge here in terms of building up people's awareness, the narrative that in many cases it's not a big faceless government and bureaucracy. It's just people doing their best. Um, Michael Lewis, who's one of America's greatest writers, has been doing a lot of writing recently about the stories that people don't know about you know faceless government workers who are actually saving lives. And when you hear those stories, they're hard to forget. He tells a story about a guy who figured out uh, over years of research how to map the ocean currents and the winds so that if somebody falls off a boat, a cruise ship, the Coast Guard can figure out based on the location of where the incident was reported and how much time has passed, where they should go to pluck them out of the water. And when this guy started his research, you know, some of the money went for him to, it was like funding so he could get, styrofoam dummies that weighed the same as people that could be dropped in the water. It's the very sort of thing that if you were an asshole like Trump, you'd fish it out of the long list of things that, why are we making government grants for this? Right.
Yeah, and then like the people that went out of their way to do those things, he would accuse them of just being inherently corrupt, or he would accuse them of
Well,
being like,
because his agenda is to destroy. He doesn't respect any of this. He doesn't understand it. And the people around him are ideologically committed to tearing it all down. But when you hear the story and then you realize that the Coast Guard saves hundreds of lives a year, performing a miracle of somehow finding people in the open ocean hours after they've fallen off a boat, because this one guy actually was nerdy enough and hardworking enough and had the government support to figure it all out. And now that we have that, you're like, well, of course we want that to continue. Um, and no, the private market isn't going to create this service for you. It's just, there's no profit in it.
it's just
Nobody,
the it's just the
oh,
patriotism of ordinary Americans that want to
right,
serve their country even when people accuse them of like rigging the system.
exactly. But that's so it's not that the American people are spoiled. I think there's just like a problem of lack of information. Our media tends to tell negative stories more than positive stories. There's more, you're going to get more clicks when you inform people of a scandal than when you tell them about something that's working, right? Robert F. Kennedy can try and blow up decades of public health knowledge because we are two generations away from people who used to go into iron lung machines because there was no cure for polio. We are 2 decades away from, thousands of little children dying every year from measles. When that all comes back, if these people really get to do what they're doing, maybe the tide will turn again. You don't know what you've got till it's gone.
Yeah, so like maybe so like there were some times when I was reading headlines about the like Elon Musk and Doge and all this like all the stuff that they had been cutting in the federal government. And there was a part of me like the back of my head that was just thinking, this sounds like one of the worst things of all time. This feels like irreparable damage. Like, do you think the stuff Doge has been doing, do you think it's irreparable?
Not irreparable in forever, but definitely this is damage that will take years, if not longer, to repair. And I'm not saying that the system worked perfectly beforehand. There's no question that we've allowed government to get too slow, and uh, you know the process of getting a project approved can take too long. Um, but the way you fix that is with a scalpel, not with a chainsaw.
Yeah, this is like they're taking stuff that like should require a scalpel and they're like So they're sometimes they're using a chainsaw, and sometimes it feels like they're using a nuclear bomb instead. Um,
Yes, nuclear bomb is a better word for what they're doing. I mean, at the the National Institutes for Health is a crown jewel of the federal government. There is nothing like it in any other country in the world. Um, a multi-billion-dollar university level scientific research establishment um, that is producing constantly cutting edge medicines and therapies. Um, and they have gone through their workforce, not just the probationary employees. I mean, they fired people who were probationary, including people because they had just been promoted to like run a whole new Alzheimer's research institute and were a new position and didn't have 3 years of experience in that position. Technically, he's probationary, so we can fire him. Well, how does that make any sense? Um, the problem is that you don't immediately feel the impact of destroying these investments um, for years, but we will feel the impact for sure. Fire 20% of the IRS's staff, and the government's going to collect $500 billion less in taxes as a result. That's not a cost benefit that makes any sense. So you're saving $10 billion in salary against 500 billion in taxes you would have collected that people legitimately owe. Um, so yes, they're doing tremendous damage. Uh, People have to wake up and pay attention because the blast radius is spreading. Um, and just to go back to my piece one last time, um, if you don't think there are people around you who know what's going on, ask. Go talk to someone in the postal service, or go. The next time you're in the airport and you're going through the security line, go talk to one of those TSA workers and ask them how they feel about their union contract being unilaterally canceled. Um, are we safer flying? When they are firing veteran FAA air controllers and getting rid of people who are being trained to be air controllers, you think we're safer? Um, it's about using a little bit of curiosity and realizing that all around us people are being affected by this, and that's why I think in the long run, meaning in the next year or two, I think Trump is uh, he's headed for disaster, and that will ultimately be his downfall. Is as more and more people are hurt, and we just have to hope that it's not a big disaster. Um, he's making our country less safe. He's opening the door to enemies from overseas who might want to come here and do us harm. Um, when George Bush was warned before 9/11 of the threat and he did nothing, Trump, he's actively making our defenses weaker. So the the thing to recognize is disasters are coming that these people are setting in motion,
do you
and we just have,
think
yeah.
do you think that like all of the protests that have been done because like from government workers, do you think that they have a chance to shine a spotlight on this harm?
Yeah, yeah, I think the spotlight is getting brighter and brighter. I think it's also in just the last few weeks, we're talking now in late April, we're seeing more institutions shifting their stance. Before April, there was a lot of obeying in advance. You had law firms that were cutting deals with Trump. You had media companies that were cutting deals with Trump. Universities that were bending the knee, like Columbia. Uh, then we had these giant rallies on April 5th. And then Harvard which is a pretty significant institution in and of itself, said, hell no. And now I think the behavior of a lot of our institutions is shifting. And more of them are saying, you know what, we're going to band together. Uh, we're not going to let them pick us off one by one. And we're going to stand for the things that we think are right. And I think that, so that's a vibe shift that's underway. I think also seeing them abduct people who are here in our country legally and throw them onto planes and toss them into concentration camps in El Salvador and then claim there's nothing they can do is also a level of shock that we had not seen before. And if they can do that and get away with it, well, who's to say they won't do it to American citizens they don't like? So I think we're absolutely seeing this moment sharpen. But my sense is they came in with shock and awe and did a lot of things because they could before they could be stopped. But in the process, they hit and hurt so many people that now the backlash they're generating is going to be even bigger.
All right. Final question. Do you have any specific advice for any like government workers or just institutions more broadly that want to do their best to fight against the excesses of the Trump administration, but do so in a way that is a lot more popular with like the median voter?
Yeah. Yeah, my advice is uh, get really good at telling your story. Um, the it's the most powerful way to change another person's mind is to speak your own truth. Okay. Um, and federal workers have a genuine story to tell about why they went into government, the commitments they made, who they were helping, and now what it means for their agency to be blown up or for them to be fired, what the impacts are. I think that kind of testimony is indisputably powerful. And yes, someone who's committed to the idea that it's all just this big, bad, corrupt, deep state, they will push back. But there are a lot of people in the middle who don't buy that theory, just haven't been paying close attention, maybe didn't really think that much about the role of government in their lives. But now, whereas in the past, federal workers were quiet and they just did their jobs. Now I think they're compelled to go out into the public square and to tell their stories. And the more they do that, I think the more they will help shift public opinion in the direction that will ultimately make it much, much harder for Trump to continue doing this.
Micah Sifry, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
My pleasure, Andrew. Thank you for doing this.